All right, hello, and welcome to the OCLC Linked Data Roundtable. My name is Nathan Putnam. I'm the Director of Metadata Quality at OCLC. Today we're going to hear from a panel of experts to learn more about their current activities and the recent experiences that they've had with linked data. Brief presentations will be given by each panelist, followed by a time to ask questions. We also ask that after the session you fill out one of the comment cards. If you don't have one near you, there are more in the back. This, of course, helps us with programming topics and making sure we have the right size room for future sessions. So I'm going to quickly introduce our three panelists, give a little synopsis of what they're going to talk about, and then, like I said, we'll do questions at the very end. Our first presenter is Xiaoli Li, Department Head in Content Support Services at the UC Davis Library. She's been involved in a number of linked data efforts, including UC Davis Library's BIBFRAME project and OCLC's linked data Wiki-based prototype. Xiaoli is the current chair of the Program for Cooperative Cataloging and has been working with PCC libraries on their transition from MARC to linked data. Recently, PCC has begun collaboration with the Linked Data for Production Phase 2, or known as LD4P2, those partners to build a pathway for the cataloging community to start shifting to linked data. Xiaoli will be presenting on the LD4P2 from two different perspectives, both the PCC as a collective entity and then also UC Davis Library as an individual participant. Xiaoli will be followed by Kevin Ford, a librarian linked data technology specialist at the Library of Congress. He currently works on BIBFRAME, focusing on how best to bring efficiency to the library's BIBFRAME dataset for the purposes of scale. Previously at the Library of Congress, Kevin was a key member of the original LC group developing the library's Bibliographic Framework Initiative, and he was also the project manager for the Library of Congress's linked data service, id.loc.gov. In between his tours at the library, Kevin managed the Art Institution of Chicago's digital asset management system, which was designed completely around the principles of linked data. He also spent time at MarkLogic, where he specialized on leveraging semantics and RDF within a document store for clients ranging from Fortune 500 companies to boutique customers. Kevin is going to provide an update on LC's current efforts with BIBFRAME and future plans, with a focus on describing work to streamline LC's BIBFRAME dataset for efficiency and scale. Last but not least is Karen Smith-Yoshimura, a senior program officer at OCLC. For over 25 years, Karen has been working with research institutions affiliated with the transnational OCLC Research Library Partnership. She focuses on issues related to the metadata needed to describe and provide access to the multilingual resources managed by libraries, archives, museums, and other cultural heritage organizations. Her most recent work studies identifiers and linked data, and she regularly blogs at hangingtogether.org. Karen will provide an update on the OCLC Research International Linked Data Survey for implementers with a comparison between the 2014-2015 results and the repeat of the survey in 2018. And with that, we will pass it over to Xiaoli Li.
Thank you, Nathan, and thanks to everybody who take your busy schedule come to listen to us. And I think each of us will probably talk about 15 minutes, and then at the end there will be an open floor for questions. Hopefully, we got a lot of questions, a lot of discussing. As Nathan mentioned, so I'm here to talk about linked data for production, pathway to implementation from two perspectives. As the PCC chair of the PCC Policy Committee, I will just give you a very brief overview. Okay, how this go?
Arrow key.
Arrow key, okay. So give you a very quick overview of what PCC as a group is doing with the project, and also UC Davis as an individual participant, and what our high-level plan is, and also some of my thinking how things should work out. Before I start those two aspects, and definitely probably, I don't know how many of you know what's linked data for production phase 2 is. If you know, I can skip that part. Okay, looks like good, I should talk about it since I prepared already. Thank you. So linked data for production, pathway to implementation. Title tells you the focus is linked data and implementation. This is funded by Mellon Foundation and is a collaborative project among 4 LD4P2 partners. And I'm listed here: Cornell, Harvard, Stanford, and University of Iowa School of Library and Information Science. And also collaborating with Library of Congress and the Program for Cooperative Cataloging, by short PCC. This project will last for 2 years, actually already started in last July, and so basically will be ended in July 20. There's 6 work packages included in this LD4P project. So first one is a cloud-based environment for original metadata creation. Thinking about it, that's almost like original cataloging. Second is metadata reuse. Again, if we want to know, the current term will be copy cataloging. And the third one is linkage, provide a linkage to external authorities and web context data. For example, Wiki data. And then also think about how to use the linked data support discovery. In addition, definitely most important for many of us working in the library is how that affects workflows. Last, in that linked data for production project will help build a broader linked data community. For PCC as an entity, we will more participate or collaborate with first 3 areas, basically translating to original cataloging, copy cataloging, and how to evaluating and incorporating the external authority data. Now switch to what does PCC as entity to do with linked data for production project. Last year, 17 PCC libraries have been awarded a sub-grant to join those 4 original LD4P partners to do this project. As I said, it started last July. So for this project, all the participated libraries sending their bibliographic records and authority records to Castellini to be converted from MARC to BIBFRAME. So that processing is going on. And once those data are converted, simultaneously and under the sort of support of Stanford, they're developing a cloud-based metadata creation system or environment known as Sonopia. So basically, this is like an interface we're all familiar with. That's where you can create metadata, or you can modify metadata, or you can reuse metadata. So that's the environment we're all familiar with. But this Sonopia will do much more. For example, you can also look up other authority data like LCSH, LC name authority, and VF, ISNI, Wikidata. So those we call the lookup service, meaning when you're doing the work, you find authority data, then you can incorporate into your workflow. In addition, Sonopia will do much more. So Sonopia will be ready for the PCC cohort library, meaning those 17 library plus 3 library, Cornell, Harvard, Stanford, will be ready for those 20 libraries start creating metadata and reuse metadata. besides doing like original cataloging or copy cataloging, the cohort library will also take this opportunity to experimenting or at least investigating following areas. So I'm just listing them here and give you just one example. What does each of those areas mean? So first thing we know is Sonopia will be using BIBFRAME editor. How many of you actually tried the BIBFRAME editor on the Library of Congress website? So Sonopia will take that BIBFRAME editor and definitely will developing it as the cohort library is using it. In addition, we'll take BIBFRAME profile editor, put it into the Sonopia for the library use as well. But as you know, the BIBFRAME is also evolving, and as Library of Congress catalogers are trying it, and the same as when the PCC cohort library is doing it, and we will also evaluating the BIBFRAME as a vocabulary and how the profile works. So one of the example, National Library of Medicine will, as one of cohort participant, will look at how to refining the BIBFRAME for serials publication. And then there will be some library looking at how to link to outside of authorities which are not normally used in our current environment. Wikidata is one of them. And definitely why we're doing cataloging, why we're creating metadata, it's supporting libraries operation at the same time. It's also make the discovery work for our users. So we definitely want to see how linked data support discovery. And so some libraries looking at how to incorporate those data into for example, blacklight discovery system. And I thought it would be very interesting to some of you. One of questions I have been asked is, does linked data actually will save library money? At this point, nobody really know. So I'm so glad some cohort library is willing to go do some analysis on the cost, doing the comparison of current cataloging workflow compared to what they would do in the Sonopia environment. And then definitely none of us has a linked data ready integrating system yet. And we still have to support our current MARC environment. So in this project, several libraries will figure out, okay, so if I do work in Sonopia, how those data get into my local system? So that type of connection. If you want to know more about what each cohort library will do, I listed the website here. You can go check it out. So now I'm going to switch to UC Davis experience. Just want to check, how much time do I have? 5 minutes, okay. So we started our project from the BibFlow, which documented workflow and also developed the roadmap for transition, starting 2015. And then 2017, we participated in one of pilot project from with OCLC, look up the authority through the OCLC sort of linked data prototype service. In the meantime, we set up sparse local linked data database, or you could call it triple store. But in our triple store, we plan not to store a lot of data, just enough data, which I can tell you later if you're interested. So 2018, we continued our linked data effort and working with OCLC on that Wikidata prototype. We call them project passage. So it was very interesting. And in fact, there's a report coming out very soon soon. Yes, soon. I like that. So a lot of things are soon. So we also try to set up a linked data discovery system and try to see if we can utilize some linked data feature go outside and grab more information to enrich discovery. And then 2018, we also participated in the LD4P2 pilot, LD4P2 project. And in this project, and this is what I'm going to talk about, what we plan to do as the LD4P2 participant. So I talked about Sonopia. That's where the catalog will input data and will reuse the data. So we will push the data into the local triple store, and I call it sparse because not everything will go in there. And then we will set up connection with Folio, open source or open source resource platform. And the reason for that is because it's open source, and we thought we could try something. And in there, we will try to use circulation and acquisition functions. And the other side of our experiment we want to try is, okay, we still get data from Gobi, from YBP, or from somewhere else. How can I put them into my local triple store and then push them into Sonopia? As I mentioned, we're also definitely looking to discovery and using the sparse metadata and go out and grab more information to enrich our discovery system. Probably use some of linked data service OCLC will provide. So all we're doing this is try to really leverage linked data promise. So what does linked data promise? My understanding at least two, maybe you have more, or disagree with me. So hopefully it will provide a richer text display for our user and easier discovery because our data will be not only on the web, will be part of the semantic web structure. Where we increase those, we don't have unlimited staff, so I'm hoping this will also provide more efficiency resulted from less data duplication, which will translate into less maintenance. In order to achieve that, you really need a community. So I don't think we can work alone. If the linked data is truly work, it should be accessible, and hopefully we'll be able to use data from many, many places. If we all follow certain standard, make it easy to reuse the data we all created. With that, thank you so much.
We're going to take questions afterwards. Yeah. Right?
Afterwards.
Good morning. Thank you for having us today. I am going to do a presentation with a lot of unexpected bullet points in it. My presentation will be broken into largely two parts. One, a very quick step through of what we've done since, say, ALA annual and what we hope to do from now between the next ALA. And in the middle will be a larger focus on what I've been specifically working on with respect to BIBFRAME at LC. So what we've done largely since ALA annual. Of course, the pilot has continued internally. We've worked on refinements to the MARC to BIBFRAME conversion. We have not actually published an updated release of this code base, although if you go to GitHub, you can grab all the incremental ones as they come in. A release is imminent, though. A fair amount of our time has been spent with collaborating with LD4P efforts and cohorts, so that was an excellent introduction to save me any need to explain. We've been working especially with the Sonopia group, in part because they're using the BibFrame editor. That work has resulted in conversations about BibFrame profiles, also largely with the Sonopia group. And then there's another group set up working with authorities, and we've been helping with them get what they need out of id.loc.gov, specifically with LCSH and names. And to that end, in fact, we released a new bulk download of LCSH this fall and a new bulk download of names this fall. And in fact, our collaboration has revealed a number of things that we could correct or do better in the names file. And in fact, we hope to have a new release, a new bulk download of the names file in the next month or so. There have been a number of BibFrame editor updates. Two of the more prominent ones, largely for use by the internal pilot catalogers, is the ability to clone works and instances, and better interaction between the database and the editor. These don't necessarily seem like huge things, but in fact, this is laying the groundwork for some type of copy editing or linkage with future cataloging. And finally, we've been just doing some internal data explorations. Internally, we've been working with a super slim representation of BibFrame, specifically to see how much we can reduce any RDF verbosity and how that impacts indexing on the inside. So right now, the RDF tends to be more on the verbose side, which makes indexing very, very simple and easy. If we reduce that verbosity, it ratchets up the challenge of indexing. And so can we find a nice balance between the two? And part of that work is the reduction of anonymous resources and or blank nodes. And this is the part that will become the most technical part of this discussion. Because I want to talk about these anonymous resources, and specifically, what are they? Well, first and foremost, they are resources like any other RDF resource. It's just that simple. You'll often hear the phrase blank nodes used. It's essentially a synonym for anonymous resources. But what an anonymous resource is essentially an RDF resource that lacks strong identity, hence the word anonymous. You can see a pretty simple example of this right here. This is a little bit RDF XML, though these two representations are basically identical, with the sole exception that the top one identifies a topic with an HTTP URI, which you can see goes to id.loc.gov. And the bottom example does not have that. The bottom one is what I'm referring to as an anonymous resource, and a resource in the system, in this case a topic, that doesn't have defined identity. Sometimes you can see this a little more clearly in a different serialization. This is the exact same data you were looking at, now presented as N triples. The top example, you can see that HTTP URI. In the bottom example, you can see that some identifier had to be created in order to link these things together. It begins with an underscore, colon, and followed by an alphanumeric string. That identifier is largely designed for a system. It's not designed for any shareable purposes, and that's basically the distinction between an anonymous resource and a named resource or an identified resource. When you have a URI, preferably an HTTP URI, that URI is shareable. It is reusable beyond a specific system. It is reusable within a specific system. When resources are identified with blank nodes, though those things are not shareable, they're not usable beyond a system, and in fact, they can be very difficult to use even within an existing system, specifically the graph. The anonymous resources get a bad rap. If you have developers, you might have heard them complain about them on occasion. But the reality is they are a fact of life. Just period. They are a fact of life. We didn't develop RDF resources. We didn't develop anonymous resources. Anonymous resources and blank nodes are actually written into the RDF spec. When they developed RDF, they recognized at that time that there would be no way to clearly identify every single resource that might be created in the RDF model. They're just part of the process. Our raw transformations take mark and they output BibFrame. During that process, we have to do something, and in this case, in fact, we're not creating identifiers. For no small reason, we don't have the identifiers in the source data. If you open up any given MARC record, you're unlikely to find URIs for subjects and names and anything else in that system. You might find codes, there might be a way to map a string to a URI, but it's not in the source data. So when we take that source data and create a raw transformation of it, it just has no URIs. We can map them later, though, of course. And another fair question I always think should be asked is, should everything really have a URI? URIs need to be minted. You need to find a way to create those. Once you have them created, you need to honor them and you need to manage them. So they absolutely come with some overhead and should be considered. So although I'm fairly zen about anonymous resources generally, they have been my bugaboo for the last couple of months now for a variety of reasons. I do think it's important to give strong identity to those things that require strong identity. Using anonymous resources results in a tremendous amount of duplicate resources in the system. And number 2 actually leads into number 3, which was really my breaking point. The number of anonymous resources are causing or will cause performance and scaling issues. And so what we decided to do after looking at some of these is start asking ourselves, can we reduce the number of them? And finally and lastly, BIBFRAME, like Mark, is principally about exchanging bibliographic information. Slimmer, more concise, more reusable resources are quite simply better for exchange purposes. And so from here on out, what I want to do is focus on providers, or what are typically called, or what we call providers in BIBFRAME. What you're looking at here is technically an instance with a provision activity. You can see that the provision activity is a type of publication. It was published in the United States by Columbia Pictures Home Entertainment in 1982. Specifically, I want to draw your attention to the United States section and the Columbia Pictures section. You see where you have capital place and capital A for agent. The capitalization suggests that that it is an RDF resource, and in fact it is an RDF resource, but what you'll also take note of is that there's no HTTP URI there. There's no identifier. Those two are blank nodes. And we have, this information is coming from Mark 260. So you can imagine how many of these we have in our BIBFRAME database right now. And again, if you look at a different serialization, you can see this blank node come into existence. Again, a whole bunch of identifiers that begin with underscore, colon, and an alphanumeric string. Those are all those blank nodes. So like I said, when you consider our data, and I'm kind of making up numbers, or I'm certainly using very, very general ones. If we have 18 million marked bib records, let's assume that 15 million of them have anonymous resources that represent provider agents. And if you think about how many times the Harcourt Brace or Penguin Books or HarperCollins or Taschen or Knopf show up in our data, every time it shows up in a marked bib record and we transform that into BIBFRAME, that's essentially an anonymous resource. So what I did one day is I extracted every single string that represents a provider, a publisher, a distributor, a producer, or a manufacturer. And in fact, what I discovered of those roughly 15 million, we in fact only had about 1.2 unique strings in that subset. So we created a provider file with that. I do want to stress the point that it is experimental. And we have put it into id.look.gov, and you can go check it out right now if you'd like. But it is experimental. What you'll see is far, far, far from perfect. And in fact, it may never be perfect. There are some things that you'll see that might make you cringe. Other things might result in audible bewilderment. Heck, you might even gasp and call a colleague over to look at the excess. But we also hope that it's promising and hopeful what you'll see. And so, like I said, we took the data and we loaded them into id.loc.gov. We extracted those 1.2 million. We applied some normalization routines. We loaded them into ID. We evaluated that. And then we repeated and repeated and repeated. And we were able to reduce that 1.2 million down to roughly 830,000 providers. And when we loaded it into id.loc.gov, it overnight became the second largest data set we have in ID. It's great. It's larger. It's frankly nearly twice the size of LCSH right now. But hopefully it might give us something to build on moving forward. BIBFRAME parses out this information. And so what we're trying to do is bring make it actionable in some machine way. Here is one of those entries, Harcourt Brace and Company. You can see the label at the top. You can see the URI just underneath it. But what I really want to draw your attention to is those series of variants down below. Each one of those variants represents a different way a cataloger entered this information into a MARC bib record. With that iterative process and normalization routines, we were able to take all of those values and make some kind of confident determination that all of those things represent the same thing. And we merged them together and then loaded them into IED, which is how we went from 15 million down to 1.2 down to 830,000. One of the other neat things that happened is it did the exact same thing with non-English providers. This actually revealed an interesting enhancement we need to make to the MARC to BibFrame conversion. Like I said, this information is coming from 260, so we're guessing right now that most of this comes from an 880, a matching 880. Right now, the MARC to BibFrame conversion does not take a 260 with a corresponding 880 and actually bring them together from the first place. So a future iteration of this, we actually hope you'll see 7 Arabic entries here and at least one that's been translated into Latin for Western readers. Like I said, we brought them into id.loc.gov. You can go to the system and search it. I wanted to throw a screenshot up here because one of the other things we did this fall is enhance the search at id.loc.gov to include facets on the left-hand side, so for any users who may be interacting with this system. One of the nice things about putting this provider file in ID is that we can leverage some of the services that exist at ID. So for example, id.loc.gov has a label service. The label service allows you to submit a string and in return get a URI if we can match that string against a resource in the system. This therefore now means that when we convert our MARC data into BibFrame and then we do the next step of trying to resolve entities in the BibFrame data and identify them with URIs, we can now ping id.loc.gov for the agents of providers. The other service that exists at id.loc.gov is a suggest service or a type ahead. So one of my colleagues actually took a very, very local copy of the BibFrame editor. This has not made it outside of our office yet, so if there are any LC catalogers in here, it hasn't yet made it to the pilot, and hooked up the new provider's type ahead with the BibFrame editor, so that if you choose name and you start typing it in, you will actually get a drop down of publishers for this particular entity, and you can choose one and add it to the file. And when you do, you'll note that there's an HTTP URI now instead of a blank node for this particular resource. It's the one very down at the bottom, a bunch of crazy letters, very long. So from now until, let's say, next summer, of course, we'll be continuing the BibFrame pilot internally. There actually will be a BibFrame to MARC conversion, at least a first cut that we hope to have out by then. There will definitely be a MARC to BibFrame update made. Release 1.4 is, like I said, imminent. Hopefully there will be an additional one. We hope to continue our collaboration efforts with LD4P. One of the things that came up recently is evaluating how our transformation from MARC splits MARC records into BibFrame instances and works, and how does that coincide with what our catalogers are doing? Are we all on the same page, for example? And finally, the continued reduction of anonymous resources. What do we do with all the uncontrolled names that we have in our data? What do we do with all the LCSH entries? id.loc.gov has the entire LCSH file. It's roughly 420,000 resources. But there are roughly 8 million plus unique LCSH headings in our bibliographic data. So you can see that there's a bit of a mismatch between those two things. And with that, thank you. There are a couple of links. The top one is general about BibFrame. The middle one will take you to a location where you can try out the demo of the editor and the profile editor, and the GitHub link will take you to much of the code for everything you find at bibframe.org. Thank you. I'm sorry.
Okay, so what's changed in linked data implementations in the last 3 years? I'm going to provide some answers. Maybe. First, some background on our series of international linked data surveys for implementers. The impetus for these surveys was actually discussions with the research library partners, metadata managers, who knew there were linked data projects out there. They were aware of some, but surely there were more. So we developed a survey instrument in collaboration with colleagues. We did some beta testing with some early linked data implementers, and we first launched the survey in 2014. And I reported the results of that survey in a series of hanging together blog posts in 2014. And people appreciated the survey, but the first criticism we got was, well, you're missing responses from some of the leading linked data implementers, especially the national libraries in Europe. So we repeated the survey in 2015, and I reported the results of that in the DLib magazine. And then 3 years passed, things changed, we were curious, so what's different? And we repeated the survey last year, and those results were reported and published in Code for Lib last November. So altogether, in those 3 surveys, we received a total of 143 responses from different institutions in 23 countries. The United States represented 42% of the total respondents, with 60, followed by Spain, the UK, the Netherlands, Canada, and Germany. In 2018, we received 81 responses. Again, 42% were from the United States, 34, but again, it was the following institutions were from Spain, UK, the Netherlands, and Canada. So we categorized those responding institutions by type, and as you can see from the second cluster from the left, we were successful in 2015 to get more responses from national libraries and had about the same number in 2018. No surprise, since the survey was distributed primarily on networks used by libraries, that the 2 top types of responding institutions were, in fact, research libraries and national libraries. The big difference in 2018, for the first time, we also received responses from service providers, those that provide linked data services on behalf of their customers. So the next series of questions were about how long those linked data projects or services had been in production. The big difference here is that the number of linked data implementers that we received responses for are more mature. We had a total of 104 projects described in 2018 compared to 112 in the 2015 survey. But from here on in, I'm going to give you a few caveats. Institutions who had responded to a previous survey did not always describe the same linked data implementation in the following survey. Of the 104 linked data projects or services described, only 42 had been described previously. Even when the same project or service was described, the respondents sometimes differed from the one who responded previously. And some respondents did not respond to every question, and so the total's different. So they're comparisons, but take it with several large grains of salt. But I do think that it's important to note that 75% of the linked data implementations described in 2018 are in production, slightly higher than in 2015, and 40% of the linked data implementations described in 2018 have been in production for more than 4 years. So we also asked how that linked data service was used. And in fact, most of those linked data implementations both consume and publish linked data. We asked respondents to evaluate the success of their implementations, and more respondents reported that their linked data project or service was successful or mostly successful in 2018. It was 56% compared to 41% in 2015, and fewer didn't know yet, as their projects were still in an early implementation stage or had been implemented only within the last 6 months. So publishing linked data, given the, among those that have published linked data in both, these responses were basically the same. The primary reason for publishing linked data was to expose the linked data to a larger audience on the web. The types of data published, no surprise, given that libraries and research libraries were the primary respondents, was on descriptive data, bibliographic data, that's data that was converted from MARC authority files. We added the question about data about people because that was one of the primary other responses from the 2015 survey, and that now tied with ontologies and vocabularies. And we also noticed that there were slightly more respondents that were now publishing linked data from about digital collections and geographic data. Now, for the vocabularies and ontologies used, we note that there were increases in those publishing in schema.org and in BIBFRAME, and more significant decreases in those publishing with SCOS and Friend of a Friend. The barriers to publishing linked data haven't changed much, so they're still in this, pretty much in this order: steep learning curve for staff, inconsistency in legacy data, the primary two barriers. For consuming linked data, the basic reason was still primarily providing users with a richer experience and enhance their own data by consuming linked data from other sources. But we did see decreases significantly on those that had first hoped to use linked data to improve their search engine optimization. That decreased substantially between the two surveys. Also, more effective internal metadata management, no longer as a big desire for linked data, and greater accuracy and scope in our search results. So although the primary objective has stayed the same, other secondary responses actually decreased, reasons decreased. For linked data sources consumed among the two surveys, ID.gov and BF are still the two primary linked data sources consumed by the respondents. But the big surprise, Wikidata surged in increase, more than 4 times that reported in 2015. And we also saw some increases in WorldCat.org and ISNI, but nowhere was the increase as significant as with Wikidata. Barriers to consuming linked data, well, primary one, should be no surprise to this audience, matching, disambiguating, and aligning source data and linked data sources, number one barrier. There were some increase in also unstable endpoints and service reliability. So we received some advice from implementers, and I'll also comment on some of the implications. A big one in terms of advice was to learn from others. There's many more implementations out there than in the past, so lots of good examples for you to learn from. Read as widely as possible, and look carefully at all the W3C recommendations and consult with community experts. Focus on your use cases. Don't just publish linked data because you can. What are the use cases? What are your problem points that you're trying to address? You should define the scope and requirements before starting any linked data work. Collaboration with others, don't try to do it yourself. Before you start, see who else is doing something in the same area. Integrate linked data into your daily workflows. Primarily, almost all the respondents are doing linked data as an add-on to their normal, regular work. Analyze what legacy data should be converted. Kevin mentioned earlier, some data might just not be ready for linked data or should never be exposed. And I can think of a number of data that we have in library catalogs you wouldn't want to share. How much did you pay for that subscription? Who was your donor for that collection? There's information that should always be considered ones that are institution-specific or even private. This one's an important one. It's repeated over and over again. Never, ever, ever, ever underestimate the amount of data cleanup that will be required. I'm sorry, guys, but the data is just not perfect. And as Kevin said, he's not sure it'll ever be perfect. Well, there's a lot of work, and I do think that is one of the main things that any project manager underestimates is the amount of data cleanups needed. Use existing identifiers and ontologies. Resist the temptation to just keep minting your own. Iterate based on user feedback. And expect benefits only after reaching scale. This is not once you get it out and suddenly the whole world has changed. You need to reach a certain network scale for the impact to really be felt. So the implications I drew from all this was, one, there is the emergence of these service providers. And that may well mean that your individual institutions, there's less need for you to publish or consume your own linked data. You have service providers and more groups of cohorts implementing linked data. So maybe you don't need to do it on your own at all. I notice a growing diversity of linked data implementers, especially in the cultural heritage organizations. In fact, of the new implementations that were responded, 42% of them were new, not described in previous surveys, and were outside the library domain, which also offers us the opportunity to take advantage of overlaps between the kinds of resources we described and those described in other domains. But unfortunately, fortunately, depending on how you look at it, most linked data implementations so far remain experimental or educational in nature. Few of them have been integrated in their daily flow, and the Oslo Public Library even said, as far as I can see, Oslo Public Library is still the first and only library with its production catalog and original cataloging workflow done directly with linked data. And I think that's correct. It's the only one that's completely in production and has gone forth solo. So to close, we have the comment, the future of data for libraries is in linked data, and the longer we wait, the further behind we're going to fail. So for more details, I encourage you, we have everything documented, including the whole survey responses from 2014, 15, and 18, all on an Excel workbook. There's a link onto the linked data page on the OCLC research themes at that URL. And thank you.